Okay, so today we're going to continue our Module 1 to learn more and to understand more about how to instruct students, best instruct students in order to best assess them. So in order to understand how to assess and what to assess, or what assessment is needed to be used with specific students based on their levels, we really need to learn first about teaching and learning approaches and theories of language development. Without doing this, we're really eliminating a foundational base of teaching and learning before we come to assessment. We talk about assessment right away, we're eliminating this foundation, and from that you're also eliminating how to assess. This question of how to assess the students or which kind of assessment is best with this student, if you don't do this foundation, you're not going to be able to answer this question. In the screen here, what you see in front of you is the three main teaching and learning theories. In general, teaching and learning, and specifically for the purpose of this course, teaching and learning of language development. So let's take one by one. You'll see here that there are three theories: behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism, and then I divided it into the features of how the learner acts under these approaches or in these classrooms, how the teacher teaches in this classroom or through this approach, how the students are motivated, and then the process or the strategies that each teacher uses under each of these approaches. You'll see that I have a picture up there on top of each theory or approach of teaching, and this is to just make a connection between the teachings of this approach or theory and how the content of it is really or truly represents. So behaviorism, if you look at the picture, it's like student is treated as just an empty container or empty vessel, and you really are adding or pouring in information into their brains without them interacting with the outsider world. So you're the only source of knowledge. The teacher is the only source of knowledge for this student. So let's look at here. Behaviorism started in the early 20th century, and it was more used in that time of or decade before our time today. You might find it used in some psychotherapy classrooms, or some students with specific needs, or even in some of language and linguistic classrooms until now, or currently used by teachers until now. So the learner here, what are the features of a learner or a student that is in a behaviorist classroom? The students are usually provided with specific sets of behaviors and expectations. The teacher prompts the students to do specific things, to repeat specific behaviors, and it is expected from the students to act in a specific manner. The teacher provides the stimuli, and the student react based on the stimuli that was given. So basically, the student is a passive recipient of all of what the teacher is trying to get them to do. You are always constantly trying to get the student to abide by specific sets of behavior, repeat and memorize specific content, and the stimuli is a reward, and the students work on it in order to achieve this ultimate goal or gain this ultimate prize. So, is there an interaction between the teacher and the student? No, the student's job is to absorb everything the teacher is introducing from the outside world. The teacher is introducing content, introducing sets of behaviors, bringing the students to do prompts, repeating specific reactions, and the student is receiving all of that, absorbing all of this, and acts upon it in order to achieve an ultimate goal and gain an ultimate prize. What does that make the teacher? If the student is passively reacting to specific actions of the teacher, then the teacher is the center. The teacher is in control of the actions. The teacher is the one that provides the behavior, provides the content, and it's an only one source, mono source of knowledge from the teacher's perspective, and the student receives that and acts upon achieving what the teacher is expecting from him or her. How do you think the students are motivated? The teacher makes sure that there is a source of motivation either by classical, which is conditioning, which is based on Pavlov's theory, and I'm sure that all of you know about the dog who salivates every time the food is introduced with a bell. Now that is called the classical conditioning, where there is a natural action of salivating when you see the food, but then there is a conditional presentation of the bell that rings every time the food is presented. So there is a connection now, a new connection or association that brings the bell every time that now the dog hears the bell without even introducing the food. The dog will start salivating. So it was implemented in education where teachers actually introduced a specific prize. Every time the teacher gives or introduced or talks about a specific prize, could be even a grade, the students act upon it and do the natural reaction of working to achieve or to gain this end result. In the operant or Skinner's conditioning, it is more associated with reinforcement, positive reinforcement, or punishment as a consequence of specific action. So it was added to it this piece of association of reinforcement. Every time you do this, you're going to get a prize, but every time you do not do what's expected from you, you are punished. So the students are always looking to achieve the expectation in order to get this expected reward and in order to avoid this punishment. What kind of motivation that is? It is called extrinsic motivation because the students are no longer interested in the content that they're learning. They are more interested in the prize. It depends on what the teacher is giving them. If the teacher is not giving any prize or the teacher is not giving any grade, the students are no longer interested in doing the homework or doing the classwork or even participating in the content. You hear some students say, "Is this for grade?" This is because they were conditioned that every time they need to do something, they'll get a grade for it. And if they're not getting a grade or a star or any kind of recognition or reinforcement, then it is not really worth it. They don't care about the content, but they care about this grade or this ultimate goal or prize. What kind of strategies or processes the teacher uses in such an environment in a behaviorist classroom? The teacher uses a lot of drilling and repetition in order to get the students to understand, or not to understand, to keep repeating the sets of expected behavior. The teacher needs to drill a lot. Drilling can be either through content drilling and memorization or behavior drilling and memorization. Teacher has to give lots of feedback in such an environment, and again it goes back to this positive or consequential reinforcement. The students need this kind of reinforcement, need this kind of prize in order to associate their hard work with. So if they did their work and yay, they're excellent, they finished their work the first, they want this acknowledgement from you to say, excellent, good job, you're the first one who did that. That's something that students strive for, and believe it or not, they finish their work just because of this, to wait for this recognition or feedback. Now, teachers usually in this process, they use lots of chunking in order to help them achieve this drilling and memorization. So you'll find a lot of chunking, a lot of memorization, a lot of drilling, accompanied with definitions. And when you see a teacher teaching vocabulary lists using memorization of vocabulary lists, the spelling of the vocabulary, and then the definition of each word, that's a pure behaviorist approach where you take vocabulary and words in isolation from context and you want them to memorize them and memorize the definitions in order to put down or to answer a specific question, which is basically, this is for the ultimate goal of getting the grade. What kind of activities used in the classroom? Activities are merely based on worksheets. Students use a lot of worksheets to answer questions, and that's part of the chunking and drilling of understanding content. Students answer math questions and exercises in worksheets, grammar exercises and worksheets, vocabulary definition and memorization and worksheets. All of the activities in a behaviorist classroom is based on some sort of chunking and show off of excellent memorization of a content. And the assessment is usually based on something like a test or a quiz, because again, the ultimate goal is to make sure that the students memorize this content, and the ultimate goal for the students is to get a high grade. So that's basically how a behaviorist classroom will look like. The expectations from the teacher and the expectation from the students, and how they interact together, and what kinds of strategies used in this classroom. Now, the next development of teaching and learning theories came to introduce cognitivism through Vygotsky's and Piaget's theories. Vygotsky said that we learn best through social interaction. Students come with specific background and rich information that they gained through their social interaction and cultural backgrounds. They come to the classroom and they're ready to interact with the outside or social context. And through this interaction, they're bringing their background knowledge to the surface to familiarize themselves with the outsider context, and then they absorb what they interacted with in the outsider context to sort it down and add it to their background knowledge. So there is always this kind of interaction between a person and what happens or what he has in his brain and what's happening outside in the outside environment. So the student receives knowledge from the outside, processes information and understands it, sorts it, and categorizes it based on their background knowledge and what they know, and then retrieve it later. This process is called assimilation of knowledge through the schema of your background knowledge. Schema, the meaning of schema is your background knowledge. So you're always receiving from outside, processing, sorting, and categorizing based on what you already know or your background knowledge, and then retrieve it later as part of your schemata. And Piaget also enforces the fact that there are different stages of our learning. We learn in a specific way in our developmental stage of growth, and every time or in every stage we grow or develop, our brain develops differently and we receive information in a different manner. I think you're going to learn more about Vygotsky and Piaget's stages in methodology classroom, but right now I'm giving you, either you took it before, I'm not sure, I think you took it before this class, but this is a renewal of or reminder of the connection between Piaget and Vygotsky's theories of learning and how it's perceived in the classroom, and we're going to bring it in later in how it makes a difference in our choices of assessment. What does that make the teacher? If the student is doing this active mental process of sorting, processing, receiving, and retrieving, then this makes the teacher not the center anymore. Who's in the center now? The student. The student's brain is becoming, if you look at the picture here, the student is always thinking, always remembering, always sorting and processing and putting categories in the storage of knowledge and learning, which is in the brain. So the brain is always in this interactive phase, if you may say. This makes the teacher not in the center anymore. However, the teacher is the creator of this context. The teacher is the one who structured this environment to facilitate the brain processing, this process of interaction, of mental interactive interaction with the outside or social context is something that facilitated by the teacher. So it is a student-centered classroom. It's a student-centered classroom where student is taking action in their learning process. However, the teacher is still a facilitator. The teacher did not step out of the whole picture. The teacher is always there to tap into prior knowledge, to make sure that there is always this safe environment for the student where knowledge is structured, students are perceiving it, they are making connection with their prior knowledge, and they're actually capable of sorting and making sense of it, and then retrieve it when it's needed, when there is a question or a problem or a project that they're working on. So the teacher is always involved through this guided practice. What kind of motivation? Now, are the students waiting for a prize from the teacher to give them, or they are actually working through the process because they're interested? They are now interested. Their brain is taking action. The brain is involved because they see something familiar to them based on their prior knowledge, and their curiosity is starting to increase and develop based on what they see from the outsider world. So this curiosity is bringing the linkage between what's happening outside and what they already know, and they start to build on it, build new extended information, and sorting them and making sense of them and processing them until they get the chance to retrieve it. So it is an intrinsic, not an extrinsic motivation, like in the behaviorist approach. What is the process that the teacher uses in such an environment, in this classroom? The teacher facilitates a discovery activity process where the students are making this connection. They're discovering about what they know already and what is out there for them that is kind of a complementary information of what they've already of what they already know, and now they're discovering more in order and researching more in order to add to what they have, to add to their prior knowledge. And the teacher usually uses group work in order to help facilitating such discovery and research. Students interact together, and through their interaction, through this social interaction, students get to learn a new piece, discover a new piece, and make sense of it after they discuss with their peers. Differentiation is something that is an essential piece of guided practice. The teacher is always there to help, and when help is needed, when a student does not have a prior knowledge or the student needs support in language or content or process, the teacher is always there to differentiate and make sure that the students' needs are met. So it is part of the process, and I know that you learned about differentiation also in the same course of methodology and differentiation scaffolding, and we're going to talk about it later in relation to assessment more than in teaching, because I know that you took that from that perspective, from teaching and learning perspective. So we'll take it from a different perspective when we get to the assessments. Now, how do you think the teacher, or how do you think assessment process is implemented in a cognitivist classroom? Students are always working on self-assessing themselves. They're self-assessing their knowledge, their prior knowledge. They're self-assessing if they understand this, and they're always going in a cyclical process of sorting and receiving and assessing, and then checking if they are capable of retrieving the knowledge. And this is always through a safe environment of group work, group discussions, research, and discovery interactions. Because the teacher is always a facilitator, and she always or he always structures knowledge, you find a lot of mapping and graphic organizers as a main feature of a cognitivist classroom. Activities is based on research and experiments, as you see here, because as we discussed, we always want the students to be immersed in a subconscious learning, a subconscious assimilation of knowledge between the schema and the social and environmental context that they're in. Then we developed to the constructivist, which we are trying now actually to implement in many of our classrooms nowadays. Cognitivist has been and is still an essential source of teaching and learning theories and strategies in our classrooms until now, because we could not let go. The transition was immense in here, and then the transition here is starting very carefully. It needs a lot of training from the teachers side. So we're transitioning here now. We're not fully at the constructivist environmental classroom, but we're working on it. Many of the IB programs, you'll find them at the constructivist stage, or at the constructivist theory approach, where there's more of the student constructing. If you look at the picture, if you can see it, it's the students who are building their knowledge, they're constructing their knowledge. And that was started with Vygotsky and Dewey and Bruner's theories on how students are capable of constructing their knowledge based on their communities and their culture. And they take this from cognitivism and say that students come with some sort of knowledge, and it's our job to provide them with the opportunity to completely immerse in learning in a subconscious matter, where things are real enough as a continuum of their community to get them to learn more and build into their prior knowledge. So we want them to get out of the concept of we're learning a content in a classroom, but more into we're learning about real life. We're learning about things that we're going to use in our community. We come with specific knowledge from our community and our culture, and we want to add to that through another real life experiences. So that's basically what constructivism is based on, building into real life experiences, contextual knowledge, rather than mere isolated content from the context. So it's focusing on concepts more than just the mere understanding of content, if you may say. The concept is beyond what we have in a classroom setting. It is more of what's happening in the world. It's a globalized vision of a content. So for example, if we're teaching about the parts of plants, in a behaviorist approach, you're going to teach the students memorize the parts of the plant, write the vocabulary, write the definition, drill it, memorize it, and then answer worksheet to maybe identify the parts of the plant, and then take a quiz and get a score. And that would be a behaviorist approach of teaching the plants, parts of the plants. In a cognitivism, you'll be asking them about if they saw plants, so you're tapping into prior knowledge. Have they ever seen a plant? What does it look like? Maybe draw a picture of a plant that you've seen before. Now, this is how a plant, and you introduce what you see as a perfect plant. So you introduce it after you learned more about your students' prior knowledge, and then you immerse them into research about how plants look like, and then maybe plant a plant together, and they'll observe and discover themselves how the plant looked like at the end, maybe, and that would be an experimental activity. And then map and draw a graphic organizer where students are looking at different plants and comparing and contrasting, for example. But when you come to a constructivist approach, you look at plant from a conceptual perspective, where plant is part of an environmental system. You'll talk about systems. You'll talk about how we or why do we need these parts of the plants, and that every single thing in the world has a specific system because each one helps the other in that part of a holistic system to grow. So students start to immerse into discussions about systems and why systems are important and what are the different aspects of the system that we need in order to help something to grow or develop. And then from there, they get to the plants as an example of growing systems that lead to development. You look at the pieces or the parts of the plant. Students experimented and explore ideas of plants in the world and how plants differ from one part of the world to the other, and why do they differ, and why these parts of the plant differ from one environment than the other. That's a more of a constructivist approach where students are immersed into critical thinking, globalized thinking. Now, what does that make the teacher? The teacher is now, yes, the students are still, like the cognitive is the center of the classroom. The students are the ones who are creating this kind of knowledge, but the teacher is stepping back a little bit. They are doing all of the work in the planning phase, but when it comes to the classroom where the activity is starting or the discussion is starting, the students are the ones who are doing everything, and the teacher is moving along. The teacher is hands off now to be a facilitator or hands on a little bit. From like in a cognitivism, the teacher is still hands on, the teacher is still differentiating, structuring knowledge, graphic organizers, mapping knowledge. But in here, constructivism, students are creating their own knowledge. So they can be creating their own graphic organizers or mapping of what they think makes sense to them. So at the planning phase, the teacher is in control, but once they led the process, they let go and they make the students have ownership of what they're learning and what they come up with as an end result. Motivation. In here, you really cannot see that it is only extrinsic or it's only intrinsic. The students are always in the process of engagement. They want to learn this, so they're intrinsically motivated, but they're also extrinsically motivated because there's this sharp discussions that make some sort of competition rises when students are trying to prove arguments or show off a specific highlighted upper level piece of knowledge. So there is this extrinsic motivation that comes through competition and discussions. What is the process that's used in such an environment? The teacher is in such an environment is using what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. Here, you're not keeping them safe any longer. You're taking them from the step of where the students are, and you're pushing them a little bit further as a challenge to get them to an area where they are trying to learn something more than where they are, but yet not challenging them too much to get them to a higher effective filter where they get shut down because the material is higher than what they can achieve or comprehend. So the zone of proximal development is this shaded zone in the middle between where the students are at their level. So if a student is at a level 1, you don't want to push them too much to a level 3. You don't want the material or content that will challenge them where they feel a failure, a sense of failure, because you're pushing them too much at a level 2 or a level 3 where they're still at level 1. But if you continue to teach at a level 1, you are not challenging the students and you're not creating this critical and creative thinker any longer. So we need that zone of proximal development where you're pushing them to their level 1 plus. You're not pushing them to a level 2 or a 3, but you're pushing them to a level 1 plus. And that's important according to the constructivist approach, because you are creating a student who can think and develop, use their prior knowledge and not staying there forever, but actually adding to their prior knowledge through their interaction with the outsider world. You always need to have scaffolding and differentiation in the planning phase, in a constructivist approach, in the planning phase, where you actually thought through about where their zone of proximal development is, and you created the activities and discussions based on a scaffolded content that meets their level +1. Students in a constructivist approach are always engaged in activities that are project-based, case studies-based, interaction and discussion-based, and you assess them based on more of just a test or a quiz, but rather on critical thinking questions. Students are immersed in real life situations, and you can evaluate their understanding and knowledge through their interaction with that social context. Through critical questions, you get to understand and evaluate whether they're getting it or not. And then you always redesign and scaffold content in order to meet any obstacles in their understanding once you evaluate and you feel that the students are still not there yet. So you intrude to scaffold, and then you get out of the process again, evaluate and come out of the process again. So that's basically the main theories and approaches of language development. And it's important because you need to understand how you're teaching right now, where your students are, how are you which approach are you using, where your students are at that spectrum. Are they passive? Are they mentally active? Are they taking charge? Where you are in that process, are you taking control over the classroom? Are you letting go a little bit, but still letting go for the students to be in the center of interaction, but yet you're still guiding and structuring knowledge? Or are you planning, scaffolding, and then letting go and having the students take ownership of their learning? What kind of motivation are you creating in the classroom? Are you creating an extrinsic motivation, waiting for reinforcements, a reward or a consequence? Or are you having the students to be fully engaged and hence intrinsically motivated? Are you creating this mix of intrinsic and extrinsic competitive discussion and action in your classroom? What kinds of processes are you following? If you're using this and then you decided to do a process of project-based or research, then you're really not on the same page. You really are over the top. You're doing a specific expectation throughout, and then suddenly you do a project-based or research-based, then you're confusing the students and setting them to failure. So you need to be consistent with your choices. Also here, you cannot always give structure and facilitate knowledge and then suddenly let go in a complete research process where you're completely hands-off from facilitation. Also here, you cannot give students complete ownership and then suddenly start to intrude in the process of their case studies or project-based learning processes. So you really need to know who you are, what do you expect from your students, and then what kinds of strategies that you're choosing in order to best match your instruction. Once you understand this, you are getting a big chunk of understanding how you're adding to your students' development and to the students' learning, and you're making a better choices of the kinds of assessments that you're choosing for each classroom environment. Now, this brings me to something that I read in the WIDA theoretical framework. It says in the framework that at school, teachers must take into account each student's stage of language development, and that's what Piaget was talking about, the stage of language development based on our growth, and that's hence the cognitivist approach. So teachers need to understand the stages of the language development of their students so as to provide relevant instructional practices. Since language development is a complex, long-term process, students should have access to authentic curriculum concurrent with language instruction. Empirical research indicates that with access to grade level content, students' academic literacy development and performance improves on standardized assessment. Do you see how the link between instructional practices, understanding the stage of where they are, and choosing the right instructional practices for them leads to improvement in standardized assessment? So this foundation of understanding is essential to make you intentionally teaching rather than intuitively teaching. You don't want to be all over the place. You need to be intentional. The difference between intentional and intuitive is that as a teacher, you're making choices because you know what you're choosing, where that is leading, and what is the consequence of that choice at the end. But if you're intuitively teaching, you're doing things because you think or you feel that this is how it should be. And usually intuitive teaching is great, but the results are always random. It could work, it could not work, because it's not a studied choice. Intentional teaching is more of a studied choice where you know the chain of each choice that you're making. So from that, it makes me feel that I want to learn more about language development, and specifically for the purpose of this course, we need to learn about second language acquisition, development, and hypothesis, and this will make us understand another layer of teaching and expectations of our students, our ESL students specifically. I'm specifically highlighting our ESL students. So in general, now I know the instructional approaches. Now I need to learn more about the expectations of students learning a second language. And this brings us to Krashen's second language acquisition hypotheses. And I have this as a part of our readings for this week, and I'm hoping that you are listening to this lecture after you have read this piece and Krashen's chapters of the second language acquisition hypothesis. And here I try to be a cognitivist teacher who's using more of mapping and graphic organizers to just elaborate more on the content of the hypotheses. I wanted to make sure that you understand what each one indicates. So the first hypothesis Krashen discusses is this intentional understanding of the difference between acquisition of the language and the learning of the language. In an acquisition of the language, you're learning it in a subconscious manner. Like we learn our first language, you are just immersed in the environment, and by practice and by interaction, you get to learn it without emphasis. Every time you're learning something, you're not emphasizing on what the word is or the meaning of the word. You get the word, you use it when you understand it after you heard it used in a specific context several times. So a child learns that a chair is a chair because every time their mother points at it and said, go sit on the chair, go sit on the chair. And a student or the child learns the word chair because they used it frequently, and they know the function of the chair because through a social context, they just learned it subconsciously. So they can use sentences and words based on their interaction with it socially. But in learning, it is really more of this academic learning of something. You're learning in purpose. You're not subconsciously immersed in a situation where you learn something because it's so. No, you're learning something because you learned the rules of it. You learned the definitions of it. You learned how it's used. So there's a difference between acquiring something subconsciously through immersion or learning something because you took time to research it, discuss it, learn it, and understand it. Now, the implication for this is that when students are acquiring a second language in your classroom, acquiring English, and in that process of acquiring, not learning yet, whenever you correct their pronunciation of something, you really are doing a pause on their acquisition process. You're having them, rather than subconsciously learning a language and how to use it, to get them to suddenly, consciously learning this language. So if a student keeps saying, for example, I'm thinking of an example of the ball hit the boy, and every time he says it, you say the ball hits the boy, the ball hits the boy. You correct the student every time he pronounces or states the statement of the ball hit the boy. Your instinct is trying to teach that student the correct grammar of the sentence. But what you're doing right now is actually hindering the acquisition process of having the student utter a statement and get them to use it. And from frequent usage and from frequent listening of the proper grammatical structure of the sentence, they're going to get it eventually. But when you put them in this correction phase all the time, you're taking them from the acquisition phase to the learning phase. This correction can lead into either confusion, or it could lead into hindering or shutting down the student, because every time they try to utter or use the language, you are showing them that they're still at an error phase. They're not capable enough to produce correct sentences. So it is important for Krashen that teachers understand that it is okay that students are acquiring first, because this is the natural process of learning any language like we did in L1, kids pronounce mistakenly or structure the sentence in an incorrect manner even when they're learning their L1, but through interaction and continuous listening to the proper pronunciation or sentence structure, this leads them at the end to producing a correct content. So acquisition is a natural order before learning a language. Which brings us to the next hypothesis of a natural order. Now, there was a tendency before in teaching grammar heavily in classrooms in order to teach them English as a second language. But there is a lot of debate between how do I need to teach a student, an ESOL student, the language, the pronunciation of the language, starting from the phonics all the way until producing academic, comprehensible English writing or reading. According to Krashen, he says that after he said that there is a natural order of learning in general, which is the distinction between acquisition and learning, there's also a natural order hypothesis of learning English. Some use this arrow here shows what it's called bottom-up structure or model of teaching a language, where teachers, ESOL teachers, teach ESOL students the phonetical awareness of sounds and letters and syllables of the English language. So they teach them the letter B, and the B sound is B, or the S and H diphthongs, where when you combine them together, they produce the sound sh. And then from there, once the students learn the sounds and the letters of the letters, the teachers start to move them to the next level of understanding morphology. And the morphology here, where you're teaching them the form of words and how to identify them. So for example, they will identify play. If you add ed at the end, played, the suffix ending of ed, the student learns that this is something that happened in the past. You teach them plural and singular and possessive nouns and past tense, all of this under the morphology, which is the second stage after phonics. So in here, what Krashen is trying to say that students learn English as a second language through an order. Do not expect students to understand the English without a specific order, and you have to expect this and have this expectation in your teaching. Now, which order? Are we going in this order, which is the bottom up, or are we going in this order, which is a top down? Let me explain to you, like I was explaining to you, the bottom up order, and then I'll explain to you the top down order and what Krashen thinks is the more of a natural order. So more of a behaviorist approach, the order will be a bottom up, where you cannot move from one stage to another until the student masters that level. So in a bottom up, you have to start with the phonics sounds in isolation from everything else. You have to start here, and once the students know the letters and know the sounds of the letters and know the combinations of diphthongs and morphemes and all of that, and know the production of the sounds of each of that, then they're ready to learn about morphology, which also has specific steps of learning prefixes, suffixes, then teaching them about ing, the significance of or identification of a word with an ing and what it means, a plural form, and then irregular past, regular past tense, and singular and possessive. That's another order. Once the students learn and master the morphology stage, you move to the next stage where they actually now are capable of forming grammatically correct sentences, where the sentence includes a subject, a verb, and an object. The verb based on what they've learned here in the morphology, and are capable of actually spelling out and pronouncing each one of them based on the phonics stage. So once they are capable of knowing their words, putting them in a subject verb object agreement, and they're grammatically correct, they're moving from the syntax level to the semantics level, where it's more stronger now. We're looking at examining meanings and implications. So they learn more about synonyms, antonyms, the difference between to, and to, and identify the meaning of words based on its implication in a context. Once they are capable of doing this stage, they move to this final stage of pragmatics, where students are using all of their prior knowledge and schemata in order to make inferences and intonation of what they're reading or what they're writing. So they're at the stage of being capable of solving ambiguity of sentences and sentence meanings. So, for example, if a student has their juice spilled on their book and the teacher says, "Oh, well done, good job, that's great." If a student is not at a pragmatic phase, they're not going to understand or be able to solve this ambiguity of this sentence. Did I really do a great job, which what it means here, or what it means here in a perfect grammatically correct sentence, or am I inferring here that the teacher is completely upset of my action and she's being sarcastic of what I've done? This is, yes, it might be the process of how someone can learn a language, but we're not putting in consideration that it's a pure behaviorist approach where you're actually having the students learn something in isolation based on chunking and memorization of rules of each stage right here. In a more constructivist approach or a cognitivist approach, where you actually trusting students more and putting them in situations where they're interacting and acquiring knowledge, and until they reach their full understanding of rules and how structures is created. So you put the students in social situations where they might be facing a lot of sentence ambiguities, inferences, and understanding of tone, and through that and through repetition and through interaction, they start to understand more about synonyms and antonyms. They start to understand what a grammatically correct sentence might sound like or how it makes sense to structure a sentence. And then they start to build on their vocabulary, and of course are capable of sounding out letters and sounds because of this interaction and mingling and entangling in a social structure. So that's more of a top-down, where students are using their prior knowledge of their own L1 and their own acquisition of their L1 through their community and cultural and social context, and use the same parallel process to learn their L2 through this interaction, through an immersed usage right away of the language itself, through content, through discussion, through interaction with others. That's a top-down. So a bottom up, we know now what it is and what are the downfalls of that. It's this isolation of context. And the top down, we learned about it, and the downfall for this is what linguists or socio-educational theorists may call that it might marginalize specific language or linguistic structures when students come from a complete different structure of knowledge. So if we talk about a Spanish speaker ESOL student, they are still capable of using a parallel sound and structure of sentence, and use this when they're starting to immerse in an English context. But if we talk about a student who probably come from a complete different structure of language, like Chinese, Indian, Arabic, you find them incapable or struggling more and needing more facilitation and guidance in that process, because the parallel understanding of how their structure of their sentences and pronunciation of words is completely different from the sets of the context in English. So the prior knowledge might not match all the time with the actual English context when they're learning here in the US. So in the middle, Krashen proposes what it's called interactive model. This interactive model creates this continuous interaction between each stage and the other. So you're immersing the students in a social context where they're discussing, they're listening, they're reading something interesting, they're doing something interesting within a context, but yet you are tapping into teaching them content on how it is expected to be sentence to be structured, or the steps or morphology of or phonics. So you're tapping into each one of them. You're not going in this direction in isolation. In here, you have to keep true to each stage when you do the bottom up. And when you do the top down, you're just immersing completely without any structure. But in the interactive model, you are, from the word interactive, there is an interaction between each stage and the other. You are not putting the stage in isolation, but rather embedding it in context, in pragmatics right away. So you're taking phonics and you're including it in pragmatics. You're taking morphology and you're including it. You're taking syntax and then you're discussing again morphology and sounds, but then also looking at synonyms and tonation and inferences. So you're always interacting between stages. Once you understand what your ESOL students need to learn in a natural order, and once you understand where they at and what they need, you are again targeting to reach success. You're targeting the needs to reach success. It will elaborate more also when we come to understand this phase where students, you're having them acquire the knowledge, You're having them in that interactive model of a natural order between all of these important stages of learning. These are the essential stages of learning English language. You have to teach these things in order to teach English language. There is a natural order to teach them. You just need to make sure that you're using it wisely, not in isolation from context, not context only immersion without protecting them from a high effective filter, but rather in an interactive model where you're always tapping into, you're immersing, you're tapping into knowledge, and you're retrieving knowledge afterwards. This, and I want to stop here before I come to monitor. Another stage of a natural order where Krashen discusses that even you teach things based on stages. So a typical, this is from your reading, a typical later stage is to place negative markers between the subject and the verb. So once you understand that, and a student keeps saying the negative before the verb, I know, like this one. Once you understand that this is a natural order of learning the language, you are going to let go and have the student acquire the knowledge rather than stopping them to teach them the rule of the grammatically correct sentence in the syntax. So do you understand that? So if a student said, I know, like this, you understand that this student is in the phase of acquiring knowledge. They are actually monitoring what they're producing through their acquisition. They are, through their pragmatic, where they're immersed in contextual and tonation and inferences structure, they're learning more in the, what Cuman said, called BICS, where they're starting to build a specific fluency in their intercommunication skills. They're trying to now utter and produce sentences. They're not at what Cumans called CULP, which is the stage where students are actually learning. They're not ready yet. So you understand that students now are monitoring what they're saying, and if you hinder this by making them conscious about what they're producing, you're not going to get them to this stage of their oral communication. Once they start to interact in a high level of pragmatics and are capable of using all of these interchangeably and in the correct manner, then they are ready to understand more of the academic language. They need to understand rules now in order to produce proper English, write proper English, understand why they're making their choices. Do you see how these are interacting together? Acquisition and learning, and the natural order of learning English. This is learning English right here. This is the behaviorist order. This is more of a cognitivist constructivist order, and then we need a specific interactive model where there is more guidance and more facilitation from the teacher's side as a cognitivist approach in order to get to understand this natural order. We don't enforce the learning right away. Predictable stages in the acquisition of WH questions in English include an early stage in which the WH word appears before the rest of the sentence, which is otherwise left in its normal uninverted form. How he can be a doctor. Okay, do you see the structure? What she is doing. This is a natural order of learning the language. They're at their monitor phase. They're consciously looking at rules. They might write it better, but they do not have time to think about it better, so they utter it this way. In the BICS stage, students move from a different monitoring order to rules to a monitor of their fluency. Now they're freely uttering correct sentences, and some of us as teachers say it's interesting how their oral language is perfect, but when they start to write, they're still lacking a lot of spelling and grammatical structure. That's because they're at the BICS phase. And you see I highlighted BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills. And then we come to CULP, which is when the students are ready now. After 2 years of more of this interactive model, going back and forth, starting to utter, their communication skills are starting to grow. Now we need to go to the final stage and get them to that. That's when the students are at their level 4, when you want them to get their cognitive academic language proficiency level higher. The implication here is that we need to think of what kinds of activities are we using with each one of these groups. These groups are in that monitor phase. What kind of activities are we using? How do I speak to an L1 student? Do I correct them all the time? Do I let them be and acquire the knowledge or acquire the rules of the language on their own, at their own pace? When do you understand the silent period? They might be in that conscious rules where they're actually afraid of producing sentences because they're very conscious about what they're going to produce. So they might write better, but when you ask them a question, they're still on mute. And you think, this student is not learning, and he's been here for 6 months now, or for a whole year now, and they're still not producing the language. Yes, you need to understand that some students have stronger background in their L2, so L1, so they learn faster because they have this parallel structure that they go through between the L1 and the L2, so they learn faster. And some students learn slower or do not have a strong background knowledge of learning their L1, so they take time because they don't have a parallel or point of reference to strengthen or to speed up their learning in their L2. So they need longer time. They need this silent period. They're in a period of monitoring and being consciously aware of what they're listening and what they're hearing, and then eventually they'll come to the BICS stage. You'll find students who are code switching. Sometimes they say a sentence in English and then they switch one word to their native language word. You'll know or you'll understand that they're at this phase now. They're getting there. They're just still monitoring and absorbing the language structure. Krashen's most important hypothesis is the input hypothesis, and that's related a lot to the Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. He said the I here is, let's go to this statement. An old way of learning the language is through the language structure and drills, like the bottom-up order, what we just explained. But the new one is to create an input where students are set into this pragmatic phase right away, where there is a social context But then you're always going back and forth in an interactive, communicative way where students, you look at students' level, there, this is where the student or the learner is, and then you add to it +1, the learner needs comprehensible input. You add a comprehensible input, a context of learning a syntax or a morphology or phonics. You add a context here in order to make this make sense. So through a comprehensible input, you are actually lowering the affective filter, which I'm going to show you right now, and students start to acquire knowledge subconsciously, acquire the language, acquire the knowledge subconsciously, and learn and monitor their utterance and their production until they get to the output, which is the final stage of producing. Could be in different levels. Level 1 producing is differently than level 2 and level 3 and level 4 students. Just realize this realization, this understanding of what kind of production in each level is important and essential, because it targets your assessment. You now know how or what to assess. I apologize about this. Oh, I need to install something new. Anyway, so according to Krashen, there has to be interactive input in order to teach a natural order of the language, in order to teach phonics, syntax, semantics, and morphology, and I said all of them, phonics, morphology, syntax, and semantics. I need to have a pragmatic input, an input that encourages inferences, interaction, discussion, context, to get them to understand and acquire the language structure. It's very important, though, when you choose your comprehensible input and have the students freely acquire their language, you have to make sure that you're at the zone of proximal development. And the importance of having students at their zone of proximal development is important because you don't want a high effective filter. A high effective filter, according to Krashen, blocks this input, completely shuts it down, and lowers the motivation, self-esteem, and increases anxiety. But a low effective filter where students are working at their level, zone of proximal development, not their level, but at their zone of proximal development, and the interaction between the different structures of the language is interactive through a context. All of that leads to a smooth transition of the input and between the input and the student. The motivation will be high because the students are now intrinsically motivated to work. They're interested. They want to learn. A higher self-esteem, of course, and the low anxiety because of that safe environment that you have provided for the students. This is basically the foundation to learn about how language teaching and approaches, what are the language teaching approaches are, how are second language learners acquiring the language structure, and what is the natural order of that acquisition. It teaches us more about their abilities of literacy and how the schema and cultural background affects their process of understanding a second language. They use a parallel structure to understand more about the language. Their cultural background creates a schema where they're always testing their prior knowledge in order to associate it and connect it and process it with a new content knowledge or language knowledge. Understanding this kind of interaction and reasons of choices of instruction helps you to make better choices with each level. You'll understand more with a level 1. How can I interact with that level 1? What kind of approach do I need to use with the student? How can I lower the affective filter? What is the natural order of him or her learning the language structure? What kinds of activities do I need to use and strategies that I need to use when I'm using an approach based on a behaviorist or a cognitivist or a constructivist? Now, I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other. I'm giving you the options and I'm giving you what theories and approaches say, but it's really important. What's important for me is that you understand where you belong. That creates your philosophy. And when you understand where you are, and when you understand the natural consequence of each choice you're making, you are understanding more how to approach your second language learner. You'll understand more what kinds of activities is needed in this order of his or her learning the language. What are the strategies and activities? And then at the end, we'll get to connect. Next time, actually, we're going to start connecting the second language acquisition hypothesis and stages connected to the methods and strategies that are based on the approaches the learning approaches and theories that we've discussed at the beginning, the behaviorist, cognitivist, and constructivist. We're going to make a graphic organizer to connect all of that to understand more of the so what. What does that tell me? How does that make a difference in my choices of instruction and in my choices of assessment? So this closes our lectures of this week. Please, again, read what I asked you to read, the 2 documents, and go back and make your own sense. This is my views and this is me trying to create graphic organizers for you to structure knowledge or facilitate knowledge, like what we would say in a theoretical approaches. What I want you to do is you create your own knowledge after listening to this lecture. I want you to read first. I hope that you read first before you listen to the lecture. Listen to the lecture after that, and then go back and make connections before you answer the questions on the discussion board. I see some of you already answered. I want you to examine your answers after you listen to the lectures and you finish your readings. Also, a note: when you answer questions on the discussion board, please answer all of your questions in one document. So for example, in one thread, I mean. So for example, if you open a new thread to answer the questions, say answer question number 1, and then you answer question number 1, and then leave a space and say question number 2, and then you answer question number 2 in one thread, just to eliminate confusion with the amount of threads that you're creating. It will be easier to just go to this person's thread and read their answers for all of the questions. You can copy paste the question that you choose just to make sure that we are following what was the question about again, and then answer the question underneath. I think that will be more organized. All right, Well, thank you very much, and hope you have good discussions on discussion board. I really want to see an indication of your reading and your understanding of the lectures. You can ask any question about the lecture in your threads. You can write note as a subtitle or something and say, as a note from the readings or from the lecture, I understood blah blah blah, or I didn't understand so and so. All right, thank you very much, and hope you do a lot of good discussions and critical thinking throughout this week, and to a new material on Saturday. Everything will be posted before we start on Saturday. Thank you, and I'll continue to read your blogs. Thank you very much for those who have already posted their videos. It was wonderful to see you and to get to know you, and I'll continue to follow with the rest of the blogs. Thank you.